My name is Heather Eisenlord, and I'm a partner at RPCK Rastegar Panchal.
My name is Chintan Panchal. I'm a founding partner at RPCK Rastegar Panchal.
The name of the project is Dual Guaranty Facility to finance critical healthcare needs at the front lines of COVID-19 in sub-Saharan Africa.
In short, we call it the DGF, or the Dual Guarantee Facility structure.
This project was a facility that was responsive to the global pandemic. When the global pandemic spread across the continent of Africa, private healthcare facilities were at risk of closure when governments essentially were shutting down businesses and shutting down or slowing down entire industries and asking citizens to stay home. A lot of the SME healthcare providers, which are often private providers, experienced a decrease in revenues because they were seeing less patients, which meant that they were sort of unable to continue to generate the cash flows that they needed to keep their doors open during the global pandemic. Private healthcare providers effectively deliver about 50% of all healthcare services and supports in sub-Saharan Africa. So they're really critical, especially during a public health crisis like COVID-19. Not only were they critical in serving patients who were diagnosed with COVID-19, but they also provide all the sort of standard life-saving interventions that they need to provide, such as early malaria diagnosis, pre and postnatal care, routine vaccinations, including malaria and others, et cetera. So, if left unaddressed, effectively, if these clinics were shut down, the vital health needs could overwhelm the already overburdened healthcare system during the pandemic.
Yeah, and Heather, I think another kind of piece that even magnifies kind of this particular project kind of focus was that these aren't just as you mentioned, these aren't just kind of everyday businesses, which are important enough to kind of support and save in and of themselves, but these are as you mentioned kind of SME, small and medium size frontier health clinics that are servicing significant populations, and in many cases they're the only healthcare provider that large swaths of people would have access to. So if that health clinic were to close or not be able to continue providing services, you could potentially see a kind of a domino effect or ripple effects of kind of negative health outcomes across kind of large populations of people and kind of for kind of successive periods of time to come.
That's exactly right. Unfortunately, given the nature of these clinics, private health clinics, small to medium sized, these are not exactly the clinics that are, sort of able to easily attract, say, venture capital or, other sources of capital to keep them afloat when, these sorts of economic crises are present. So, one of the potential options to sort of help them, to get them capital they needed to stay afloat, was to sort of deploy debt capital at a low cost that would allow them to effectively bridge the sort of gaps that they were seeing in cash flows. One of the entities that ultimately was very principal to this project that we're going to talk about is the Stitching Medical Credit Fund, which is an entity, an organization or a fund that's been providing debt financing to healthcare and health supports, providers in sub-Saharan Africa for, I believe since 2009. So they have a really long track record of working in these geographies and with these types of health centers. But the issue that, that MCF was facing during the pandemic or the beginning of the pandemic and even now, and that debt impact investors often, sort of come across, sort of our need to address, is that in sub-Saharan Africa, there are often not the same tools and systems in place to evaluate the creditworthiness of potential borrowers. In the United States, we have mature systems that are available to lenders, institutional investors, or otherwise to evaluate creditworthiness, but those same systems aren't necessarily available in the geographies where we need to solve this problem. Now, MCF does currently have underwriting standards that require that the debt service coverage ratio of any potential borrower that it's lending to needs to be at least 1. And that means that their operating cash flows need to have a ratio of at least 1 to the debt service that those borrowers need to pay out in the upcoming fiscal quarter. Unfortunately, some of the SME healthcare providers that really desperately needed this funding were not able to meet those debt service coverage ratios, particularly given that their operating cash flows were reduced because of the COVID, sort of reduction in services that they were providing during COVID. So this is the problem we need to solve for. How can we help MCF deploy additional loans to support these SMEs at this critical time, while still de-risking the investment for them, so that they were able to sort of meet their overall portfolio objectives in terms of sort of debt service coverage. And that's where our client, Malaria No More, came in with the idea that we could provide a guarantee facility to back those loans and unlock a wealth of additional capital. And as we'll discuss, and in the end, we're, with the dual guarantee facility, we're unlocking upwards of $30 million of additional capital to finance loans to private healthcare providers.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. In sum, I think we could say it is how kind of the question that Malaria No More was presented with, the question that we were presented with was, how can we effectively save roughly 1,600 frontier medical healthcare facilities and can avoid a massive disruption of services to roughly 5 million people? How can we kind of make that happen, and how can we make it happen very quickly?
And the very quickly part is where the deal gets really interesting, right? So when Malaria No More came to us, they were already in discussions with both the United States Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, and with MCF, Medical Credit Fund, about securing from DFC a guarantee facility of around $18 million to sit behind the loans that MCF was making to the underlying SME healthcare clinics. Unfortunately, this was a wonderful thing that was lined up, and it was great to have that on the horizon, but there were quite a lot of hurdles that had to be overcome in order to get that facility in place. There's a pretty long negotiating period with DFC, and also there are a number of regulatory hoops and consents that they need to basically jump through in order to get the guarantee in place. And while ultimately that 18 million plus guarantee facility was going to be a boon for for the borrowers that MCF could support, it just wasn't able to be unlocked quickly enough to respond to the issue at hand, which is where Malaria No More and its partner Philanthropies came in. Malaria No More was in discussions with the Rockefeller Foundation, with MCJ Amelior Foundation, and with the Skoll Foundation, which each were willing to front $500,000 in capital for a total of $1.5 million in capital to provide an emergency bridge guarantee that would link MCF and its ability to deploy capital to the bigger guarantee that was coming in from DFC at a later date. And so the problem that we were asked to solve was, how do we set that bridge guarantee facility up, and how do we leverage it for the most benefit?
Heather, I couldn't agree more. Right, that is exactly kind of the problem that we faced here, and it's a problem that we face in a lot of these types of situations where blended finance solutions are called upon. Here, as you identified, we have an existing debt facility in place, right? And we have all of the kind of constraints and advantages that come along with utilizing debt as a tool for providing financing. You mentioned a minute ago the reality that venture capital, which is purpose-built for a different type of investment, is not typically available for kind of frontier medical facilities. And that I think is part of, and I think that kind of describes the challenge that we're facing here, right? So debt, generally speaking, is a tool that that allows for the provision of capital, but it is a risk protection kind of mechanisms. It has risk protection mechanisms built into it, right? So those include kind of underwriting and the diligence that the debt providers have to undertake. It provides for kind of thinking about what those downside scenarios are if the debt isn't ultimately repaid, or if the kind of changes in the business, et cetera. And And so what we were doing is we were effectively looking at the kind of facts on the ground as they were presented to us and saying, all right, well, what is there that we could do, right? What, and initially when Malaria No More was thinking about how to address this problem, there were a lot of different options that were on the table. One was potentially to put together a fund whereby the foundations could pool their capital, and that fund could be used kind of like an SME or private kind of SPV style investment fund, and deploy that pooled capital into these clinics directly or into a broader pool, right? The other kind of scenarios that we ended up kind of utilizing and kind of gravitating towards were ones whereby we used some of the existing features that are in kind of the lending space kind of more broadly, right? Kind of the tools that are available to in lending more broadly. The idea, as we'll get a chance to dive more deeply into, was to utilize these existing lines of credit and to address the kind of specific problem, the specific challenge of these debt service ratios being effectively out of compliance or kind of in danger of being out of compliance, right? Kind of the actual block that was preventing these clinics from being able to draw upon these loans. Heather, at this point, maybe we should talk specifically about the solution that we created, given that we were dealing with a bunch of kind of actual circumstances on the ground that we're effectively structuring around.
Sure. So, I mean, fortunately, and one of the things that I think is really instrumental in making a deal like this work, we did have a lot of the parties with the necessary expertise, on the ground knowledge, and the tools they needed to make this project successful. Again, we had a medical credit fund, which, as I noted, has a long track record of providing loans to small and medium-sized private healthcare clinics in sub-Saharan Africa, including in the jurisdictions where we were looking to sort of deploy the guarantee, which were Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. So it had broad networks that had established in over a decade in those jurisdictions. It was very well connected within the healthcare sector and the private healthcare sector. And, it had developed a good model for provision of low-cost loans that could be really effective capital leverage by those facilities. With that, with that party already in place and already providing these loans, then we had these three philanthropic foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, MCJ Amelior, and Skoll, who identified the problem, knew this problem was an emergency problem, knew that capital needed to be rapidly deployed, and wanted to partner with organizations who had the relevant skills, expertise, and networks in sub-Saharan Africa to deploy the capital strategically and impactfully. We also had DFC which of course is very skilled in structuring blended finance models and providing credit support facilities, in working in emerging economies and least developed countries. So they were very conversant in the problem. They dealt with these types of problems in many different scenarios before, but they were sort of I don't know if hamstrung is the right word, but they had their processes in place which would not allow them to respond quite as rapidly as all the other parties were either willing and able to do and or needed to do. And then, of course, our client, Malaria No More, was working through what is called a joint initiative that it's working on, or that it's kind of co-founded and jointly running, called the Health Finance Coalition, which is an initiative that's basically kind of convenes leading philanthropies, health donors, technical advisors, and private and institutional investors to effectively figure out how to use catalytic capital and institutional capital to address some of the world's most pressing issues. Through HFC and its team of experts and advisors, they determined that they could effectively bring these parties together and serve as effectively what is a convening agent to help structure a deal that would best leverage the capital from all of these various parties, and also to kind of facilitate the arrangements as between these parties, the financial arrangements, the reporting arrangements, and basically just be kind of the central point of contact between these various parties.
The point that you kind of are making about kind of the role that Malaria No More was playing is I think about that as kind of almost like a quarterback role, right? Kind of they're the center of this structure that was, you know, a critical component to help bringing all of these different pieces together, right? So on the one hand, you have the DFC, which has, as you mentioned, a lot of experience, a lot of capability, a lot of expertise, and significant check writing power, right? Kind of a significant base of capital to work with to be able to address emergent challenges around the world and the mandate to do so. On the other hand, you have foundations who are very kind of focused on and experienced with addressing emergent situations from the perspective of their charitable mission, right? So, you know, they are thinking about kind of what is the problem and how can we solve it as quickly as possible. And oftentimes, you know, capital that they can bring to bear is a part of how they solve that problem. But they're not operators, right? Neither is the DFC. Malaria No More, you know, is a charity that has a lot of experience working on building and kind of implementing solutions to one of, you know, the world's oldest diseases and the source of, you know, historical pandemics. And finally, the last piece of it is an actual for-profit kind of fund, credit provider that is in the business of financing these medical clinics, right? So all of these players have the things that they can bring to the table that can address this problem, but also the structural, regulatory, tax, or purely economic, kind of from a risk standpoint, limitations that would constrain how they could effectively come together to affect a solution to this very emergent problem.
That's right. And so a couple of the problems that we needed to solve for on the structural and legal side were what does this guarantee actually look like? And who are the parties to the guarantee? And is there one guarantee to which all of the parties are, you know, all of these entities are party, M&M, the three philanthropies, and DFC? Or do we have separate guarantees that are that are structured so as to complement each other? And then the second problem that we needed to address on the structural and legal side is, how do we get the funds from the philanthropies into this into the guarantee effectively, or the entity that was holding the guarantee, and how do they do that and still, you know, ensure it in a way that's compliant with, you know, their C3 obligations? Is it done via PRI? Is it done via an MRI? Are they receiving any sort of return? So we had to think through all of those issues on behalf of all of the parties. And ultimately where we landed was the Dual Guarantee Facility, or the DGF. So the way we ended up structuring this is, and I think Chintan can speak to the actual corporate structure a bit in just a moment, but we set up a wholly owned subsidiary of Malaria No More called HFC Guarantee. And that is the entity that actually became the guaranteeing party, or the guarantor, I should say. And then the initial guarantee was between HFC, the Malaria No More subsidiary, HFC, and Malaria No More. HFC as guarantor, HFC as guarantor, and MCF, Medical Credit. There are a lot of acronyms. MCF, Medical Credit Fund, as the guaranteed party. And the guarantee, of course, was there to provide credit support and to de-risk the loans that MCF was making to the underlying SME private healthcare clinics. Now, this guarantee initially was it still is, it's a $1.5 million guarantee facility that is available to cover losses from an underlying borrower's failure to repay principal. And it effectively is available to cover either 50%, 65%, or 80% of losses, depending on the debt service coverage ratio of the underlying borrower. So if the debt service coverage ratio of the underlying borrower was at one or above, meaning it was bringing in as much or more operating cash flows as it needed to service its upcoming debt payments, then the guarantee facility would cover 50% or 65% at the option of MCF. However, if the debt service coverage ratio was below 1, meaning operating cash flows at the time that the loan was submitted for coverage of the guarantee were less than the monies that the entity, the underlying borrower, needed to service its debt going forward, then the guarantee was available to cover either 50%, 65%, or 80% of losses from failure to repay the loan, which significantly de-risked the investments for MCF and allowed it to deploy much more capital with the confidence that it knew that it sort of wasn't going to sink its whole portfolio if a lot of these loans were effectively weren't repaid. So that was the advantage of this initial guarantee. And those terms, those debt service coverage terms, and also those guarantee coverage terms, mimic the terms that were agreed with DFC. So when DFC's guarantee goes into place, those same terms will be available to MCF, which was kind of what really made this whole guarantee facility attractive. But of course, why, this first initial guarantee was needed more urgently, because that capital needs to go out now, not in 6 months or a year when DFC's guarantee was in place.
What made this even more interesting is the fact that all of this all this structuring is happening in the context of kind of shifting legal kind of ground that we're operating on. And as many know, there was a private letter ruling that the IRS put out in early October of 2020, whereby the IRS took the view formally that a fund manager who in that instance had applied for tax exempt status could not act as a charitable it could not act as a charitable party, and effectively denied 501c status to a fund manager. Now that ruling ended up becoming super relevant to what we were doing, because in order for Malaria No More to play its, as we're calling it, the quarterbacking role in effectively pulling together all of the various different elements and stakeholders in this transaction, they were effectively, really, from a legal standpoint, acting as either an agent to a kind of loan or a guarantee loan style structure, or going to be acting as the managing entity of a fund, right? Kind of akin to each of those situations. But from a structural standpoint, we identified this issue that Malaria No More's tax exempt status could potentially be placed in some sort of a risk, given their participation in the structure and this letter ruling that had come out. And so while we were working on kind of structuring the cash flow components to this, the kind of the guarantee and the timing, et cetera, we're also structuring to protect Malaria No More's tax exempt status. Part of the way that we did that was by having them operate through a kind of special purpose limited liability company vehicle, which has a special tax designation, et cetera. But the idea of originally having Malaria No More play that role directly ended up having to change in real time, and rather Malaria No More is continuing to kind of act as it always has, as a charitable organization, but given the structure, it has an interest in the medical credit fund vehicle that is acting as effectively as the agent to administer this dual guarantee facility.
So, sort of stepping back and taking a look again at the way that the dual guarantee facility works. As initially envisioned, HFC again is the guarantor. We have MCF as the guaranteed party, and we effectively, with DFC's permission, used the basic terms of their standard guarantee agreement, and then built a lot of features into that to make it sort of this, to sort of anticipate this dual guarantee function for when the DFC guarantee went live. And the initial thinking was that the DFC guarantee would be available until DFC was live, and the $1.5 million would be available on a revolving basis to cover loans that that MCF submitted for coverage. If those loans were if the guarantee was never drawn to cover those loans and they were repaid, then that money became available again, because it's effectively a revolving guarantee. But the idea is that once DFC goes live, and it's still not live for various reasons, but it will be soon. But once DFC goes live, then the two guarantees, and this is where the dual guarantee comes in, the two guarantees would sit side by side, and the HFC guarantee and the DFC guarantee would be drawn on a pro rata basis for all loans that were submitted for coverage and then drawn by MCF. That allowed, the HFC funds that were provided by the philanthropies to continue to be effective and, provided some additional leverage of that capital to support DFC's guarantee. And also allowed us to kind of grandfather in the loans that were submitted for coverage pre-DFC's effective date and allow them to be covered by the sort of joint guarantee or the dual guarantee structure. Now, a couple of sort of interesting features about this is effectively, again, the revolving nature of the initial guarantee, the fact that this could be drawn on in multiple or at least loans. The capital that was there was available to be used time and time again to support loans. Also, we were able, under the HFC agreement, the guarantee agreement, to cover certain types of loans that may not have qualified for coverage under DFC. DFC has fairly strict requirements about the types of loans that can be covered. And, for instance, they don't allow for coverage of loans that are made in connection with refinancing, repayment, or repurchase of existing debt. And they also don't allow for the guarantee of certain short-term loans. And here, those types of loans, particularly the short-term loans, are something that MCF is making quite regularly to the SME healthcare providers. And so while we were in negotiations with DFC, able to get them to provide some flexibility on those terms, HFC's guarantee was available to cover those types of loans, like basically conclusively upfront, right? So we were able to expand the types of loans that could be submitted for coverage under the guarantee, which makes it more responsive to the realities of the types of loans that MCF is making during COVID. And again, another interesting feature, of course, is that M&M, playing the coordinating agent, as Chintan's called it, kind of the quarterbacking role, is not only the guarantee under the HSC guarantee agreement, but also is sort of playing the sort of point of coordination between all of the entities, even when DFC goes live. So when DFC goes live, they're still helping M&M coordinate its reporting to both entities. Helping to sort of coordinate the reporting that goes up to the philanthropies, which M&M is taking on itself, and it just reduces the sort of burden on all of the other parties. And M&M is able to do that at a very low cost, unlike, say, like an institutional investor that's playing an administrative agent role. Effectively, the fees that M&M is charging is just to cover its costs and overhead and sort of implementing the facility. So it's at a very low cost to M&M. And then one other interesting feature about this dual guarantee structure, and then the structure that we sort of created on the back end with M&M, is that the philanthropies, rather than just kind of backstopping the guarantee directly, ended up making their contributions to this facility in the form of recoverable grants to Malaria No More, and that capital is available to sit behind the guarantee. And we've built the guarantee so that it could either, once DFC goes live, sit side by side on a pro rata basis, or if the parties determine, that it's more beneficial, we can actually wind down the HFC facility, allow DFC to step in and be the primary guarantor, and then repurpose those funds either to provide a similar guarantee facility to another sort of, similar entity, or to effectively support M&M's other charitable activities, particularly relating to the Health Finance Coalition. And if neither of those things are really attractive or don't seem particularly needed at the time, the foundations or the philanthropies can recover any remaining proceeds via the recoverable grants. So we used, like I said, we did start with DFC's principal terms, but we built a lot of bells and whistles around this to make it as flexible as possible, so that even though the philanthropies were coming in with a relatively small portion of capital compared to DFC, the $1.5 million, it could really be leveraged in a number of ways to make it as impactful as possible.
In some ways, that's a perfect kind of description of how this is applicable in lots of this particular structure is applicable in lots of other situations, right? So taking a step back for a second, effectively what we were looking to do here is to build a structure that could allow for speed, flexibility, primarily, the deployment of capital, and to inject a kind of honest broker trust, highly trusted party at the center of this structure, so that they could help bring all the different pieces of it together. Ultimately, how is this useful in other types of situations, right? Effectively, we think that this structure can be applied. The blueprint that's provided by this structure can be applied in almost any emergent disaster type of scenario situation where you need to be able to deploy capital at speed. You need to be able to bring in expertise. You need to have a coordinating function that is providing for a lot of the support around those capital providers and the needs that they happen to have. And you need to be able to do it very quickly, right? You know, in an earthquake or a tornado or a tsunami or a global pandemic type of a situation where you're trying to deploy capital at speed to be able to effectively save an industry or an enterprise or a community, and there is an existential threat to that community presented by the disaster scenario that is present. The ability to bring in together philanthropic capital to unlock kind of purpose-built profit-seeking capital, to bring in kind of DFI, sovereign, or other governmental style players, and to bring in the expertise that is provided by charitable actors. You could swap out the parties, I think, almost in this particular structure, and bring in, you could swap out Malaria No More, and you can imagine applications to the Red Cross, or you could swap out Medical Credit Fund, and you can think about applications that could be provided by Doctors Without Borders, right? Kind of, organizations that have a lot of expertise, a long history of success in dealing with these types of situations, and the financial backers who are interested in providing kind of capital and other resources to help kind of address emergent situations. I think this structure can be utilized in any one of those given scenarios. So when did the lawyers get involved? In this situation, I think we kind of almost had an optimal type of structure in that the lawyers were able to get involved early, effectively at term sheet stage, right? Kind of the problem and the challenge had already been presented. There was a broad group of kind of incredibly smart and capable and deeply experienced folks on the commercial side or the financing side of the team already assembled. A lot of the relationships were generally in place, but by being able to get involved early at term sheet stage, the lawyers, as the lawyers on the team, we were able to help think through kind of structural components, what the ultimate structure could or would look like, what the potential limitations or drawbacks would be of one structural option versus another, and the practical realities of how quickly could we go with option A versus option B, how much effectively would it cost in terms of time, resources, etc., and effectively help the business decision makers, the business side decision makers, kind of come to a decision on the ultimate structure to use that was purpose built or kind of well fitted for the circumstances that we were presented with and the challenge that we were trying to solve for here.
So we've talked about the different, some of the different possible structures that we contemplated. And in order to really think those through and analyze what would be most appropriate, we really needed expertise from sort of basic corporate structuring, fund structuring, and then of course, ultimately debt, because we were working, first of all, we were working with an underlying debt structure, with the loans being deployed. And then, since we landed on this guarantee facility and we were working with credit support instruments, debt was quite central. Debt expertise was quite central. We also, of course, needed to think about things from a tax perspective. And then, of course, we had, as we'd mentioned before, Malaria No More is a charitable organization, and we also had foundations coming in with capital. So we needed to have some fluency in issues that are presented for exempt organizations, to ensure that the charitable organizations were providing their contributions to the guarantee in a way that didn't jeopardize their 501c3 status. And similarly, that Malaria No More was playing a role in sort of aggregating this and deploying this capital in a way that similarly, protected their C3 status. So all of those areas of expertise were really central to making sure that this worked for all the parties involved.